Hi, so I'm Daniel Pacheco, and this is my major assignment 3, which is a remediation of my major assignment 2 for ENC 1101. So for my major assignment 2, which was a textual analysis of a literacy practice, I analyzed all about jazz improv. And so what I'm going to do is remediating and also revising parts of it to fit into this narrated PowerPoint that is happening right now. So let's get into it. So let's jump into a genre of jazz. So what exactly is jazz? Well, it's kind of hard to put like a strict definition on it, kind of like how in class we were talking about, it's kind of hard to put a strict definition on rhetoric. In this case, jazz has so much going on for it. So for example, blues, bebop, swing, slow jazz, big band, chamber music, etc. And at the center of it, we have improvisation, which is basically the art of just coming up with music on the spot, just like coming up with whatever. So the way jazz originated was in New Orleans. So in New Orleans, it was kind of a melting pot of a bunch of different cultures, different cultural and linguistic, language barriers. And the way people overcame that was through jazz, because music speaks through the emotions, and with the emotions, you can which is kind of like a universal language. People were able to connect with each other, and that way, all these different forms of music kind of coalesced into jazz, and then over the years, it just kept evolving and growing over the years. So to analyze into the textual analysis, I want to first focus on what individuals need to know, and I want to focus first on music theory. So when it comes to sound, everything that your normal human ear can perceive, in Western music, we decided to divide it up into 12 notes: A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Now, that's kind of arbitrary, but that's just the way we did it. In different cultures, they've divided it up in different ways, which is very cool. So the way we kind of organize these notes are through patterns called scales. So I have an example here, the C major scale. So let's play it right here. So what I just played right there was an example of a C major scale. So your typical do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, that's called a major scale, which follows a very specific pattern as shown right here. And now there are different scales, which are basically variations of that. No, the example shown is that the second sound, the one that sounded a little bit different, is known as C natural minor scale. In this case, what you basically do is you take some of the notes and you change them up a little bit. So now, what exactly is a chord? So when we have these scales, they're composed of these different notes in a certain order. And now with a chord, what you take is you take the first note, the third note, the fifth note, and the seventh note, and you play it together, kind of like alternating those notes, and you play them at the same time. And it sounds a little bit like this. So playing those notes like that produces that very distinct happy sound, a major chord. And it's composed of the notes C, E, G, and B. So now this is when things get a little bit difficult. So there are these things called modes, which is basically when we have that super happy sound major scale, like the C major scale I just described, we are starting and ending on the same note C. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. But if I decided to start on a different note, for example, if I decided to start on a D, or if I decided to start on the G, which is the second and the fifth note respectively, even though we have the same exact notes, because we're playing it in a different order, it produces different sounds. So we would give those different names, D Dorian and G Mixolydian respectively. So it kind of sounds a little bit like this. This is the C major scale. This is D Dorian. G Mixolydian. It's kind of like taking the same ingredients, but instead you're mixing them up in a different order, and as a result, the food you get in the end is a little bit different. So now, since we know that we have these different scales, and from these scales we can get different chords, now this is where the jazz starts to really get very interesting, is because we can connect these chords in certain ways to create these things known as chord progressions, and then this is what the basic structure of really a bunch of songs are. So the most common one is the 2-5-1, bong, 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 and it sounds a little bit like this. So that 2-5-1 basically takes that home bass, that center tone, and it basically takes the second note, that D Dorian, and then the G Mixolydian, and then brings it all the way back home. And what's very interesting is the way this works is because it just creates these feelings of tension, and then it finally releases at the end. So it kind of like, and you can think tension of like, oh, that feeling of discomfort before it finally gets to the end and finally feels relaxed again, that happiness feeling. So I just explained all this very interesting music theory that may or may not have been very confusing, but why is this important? Well, when we're in a jazz setting, when individuals who love jazz improv, they're trying to learn jazz improv, they're in a band, are trying to communicate with other individuals, it's kind of like how if knowing English just helps facilitate communication better. So if you understand all these terminologies, for example, if somebody yells out, oh, let's play D Dorian really quick, and then you start playing D Dorian, it's a lot faster than being like, oh, let's play the scale that goes D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D. There's a slight, it's just a lot faster to be able to say D Dorian and then you immediately pick it up. And also improvise, because D Dorian has a very distinct sound. So if you're very into music, especially those that are musicians for their career, they would be able to recognize it by ear. They've trained their ear to be able to hear that distinct sound and being able to improvise over it. Now what's interesting is when you're improvising, you're doing whatever you want, but also not at the same time. Because if you do whatever you want and you don't really have a really set structure and know what you're doing, then it sounds bad. But if you know what you're doing and you're kind of doing whatever you want, but you know how you're doing that, then it sounds more controlled. It's kind of more an organized chaos sort of thing that's going on there. So something else that's really interesting is why knowing music theory it works is because you can also figure out different ways to be able to improvise, and it also helps you develop your ability to improvise over jazz. So for example, 2 examples here. So this part I have highlighted the 3rd and the 7th note of the chords. So as I said earlier, the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th note make up a chord. Now the 3rd and 7th note are known as the guide tones. So it's one of those notes that they just sound better when you play those two over the 1st and the 5th note. So choosing sometimes to play just those 2 notes can sound pretty cool. Or something else is playing the pentatonic scale, which is basically the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 5th, 6th note of a scale. So it sounds boom, 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 boom. It's just another very cool trick that just knowing music theory and knowing how that works, you're able to implement that in a solo, and it just adds a lot of depth and richness to it. And other ways you can actually play really cool is just playing rhythmically. Sometimes if you too many different notes can be very convoluted, and just adding some rhythm to it can really make it feel very groovy and make it very distinct from other solos. Usually because in a song there's several solos playing, so it can make you stand out from the other solos and not just sound like a blatant copy of the last person that just soloed. So something that I've always heard in jazz is this idea of, oh, I don't like jazz because it's just a bunch of wrong notes. Well, what exactly do you mean by wrong note? So if you look at a piano, two keys that are right next to each other, when you play them together, it kind of sounds like this. It kind of sounds uncomfortable, it sounds wrong, but in the end, but what does it produce? It produces that tension. And so if you're able to navigate around that tension and you're able to form a release, then it's not a wrong note. Because jazz is coming up with your own things. So just because it sounds off doesn't mean it's wrong, because it creates different layers of emotions, of depth to your solo. Because the reason why that happiness feeling, that chord at the end of the 2-5-1, like explained earlier, feels especially good is because we just experienced that kind of uncomfortable tension. And you can't really have the happiness without the sadness, because if you didn't have like the sadness or the uncomfortableness, then you wouldn't be able to appreciate that release as much. And I like to describe it as kind of a form of catharsis for both the listener and performer, just from that satisfaction of a resolution sound. So this is slightly of a tangent, but it's still equally as important. So we're still on the fact, focusing on the individual when it comes to jazz performance. So I focused on knowing the theory, having the knowledge, but now there's also a physical aspect to it with knowing instrumental technique. So an example that applies to me is I play trombone. So here's a model of a trombone. Basically, you gotta know how to move your slide, because depending on where your slide is, you can create different notes. You have to know where to put it exactly because to play in tune. You have to know where to put the mouthpiece, for example right here, to have proper embouchure so that you're able to get the right notes. Because knowledge is only half the battle, because once you have it in here, being an instrumental technique is what you need to be able to get it out from your brain, get it out and get it onto your horn so that people can actually hear you. So that is equally as important. So now I want to focus now on how jazz works between individuals, how jazz is known as a language. So it kind of sounds like a very abstract concept, but really it's just language. What it really is it's just a form of communication, and jazz is just that. Just because it doesn't use your stereotypical words doesn't take away from that. And a really good example I would like to use is in jazz, well, in language, you can always create like inside jokes between people. You can have like subsets of languages over overall languages. Like for example, in English, you have the people in Britain, they have that British accent, they have their own way of speaking. And of course, in social media, there's something known as brain rot, and people kind of have their own language. They kind of speak like that, using words like skibidi or sigma, stuff like that. In jazz, they also have their own things. So there is something known as the lick, and I will play it for you right now. And it's a musical motif that sounds like this. So to any outsider, that just sounds like, oh, it's a cool little lick, do 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 do. But in the jazz world, it's known for being an annoying little lick that people just like to put in. It's kind of like an inside joke. It's kind of in English, if I were to say like a funny little joke. In jazz, this is my way of saying that joke. And people are able to understand this just through the notes. So here is a really cool example I found on YouTube. So in Mario Kart, there's a super cool lick that plays. And people who know Mario Kart, who understand the music, who remember that music, will be able to like understand the reference, because this guy, well, just watch what he does. So what's very interesting is that through music, he was able to tell this guy a joke, and it was all through music, through jazz, through the language of improv. And so something else that makes jazz a language is, you know how conversation works is usually between two or more people. One person talks and then the other person responds. They call and respond to each other. Jazz is just the same way. One person speaks, says a note or something like that, gives a little motif, and then another instrument or another section kind of respond in the same way. So here's a really cool video that demonstrates exactly how that works.
Someone else answers through what we call and response. I may play something and someone else will play it back, or simply answer what I asked. Maybe something like this. Alvin?
It's pretty cool. Literally, they're having a conversation right there, but it's not through words, it's through the language of jazz. So the way jazz can create relationships within one another is another proof of evidence that jazz is just another language. I mean, how can you form friendships within one another? You just spend time with them. In silence? No, by talking with them. So in the end, jazz can also spread ideas, just like how language can spread ideas and stuff like that. And it just goes back to what I said earlier on how English may use words, but jazz uses sounds, and sounds just hits people on a more emotional level. And since people speak emotions better than they speak any one language, that makes it more universal. So jazz is a very interesting form, and I hope this really helps you with understanding how jazz can be seen as a language. And it just finds its roots as another adaptation of people's humans' desires to survive, because in New Orleans, people didn't really know one another that well, so they used jazz as a way to be able to familiarize themselves with one another and be able to like get close to one another. And in the end, that's what we really need to survive. So as long as we still manage to find that communication between people, whether it be through words or through language, we will be able to survive. So that is my presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.